The gavel slipped from Judge Carmichael's hand, hitting the polished wood with a sharp crack. The fluorescent lights above hummed, their cold glow flattening every shadow in the courtroom. I sat at the witness stand, the microphone's metal rim cool against my lips, and fixed my eyes on his. His pupils had lost focus, his breath catching in his throat. Behind me, my father's tailored suit rustled as he leaned forward, the smirk he'd worn all morning freezing mid-curve. "My worth," I said, voice steady, calm as a surgeon's cut, "is in recognizing threats. For instance, I know the weight carried by a single name." Somewhere in the gallery, a chair squeaked. The court stenographer's hands hovered over her keys, waiting. From the last row, two men in dark suits tilted their heads almost imperceptibly, the shine of polished leather catching the light like drawn blades. Carmichael swallowed hard. How do you know that?" His voice faltered, stripped of the arrogance it had dripped with moments earlier. The air smelled of paper and my father's cologne, thick, suffocating, desperate. I drew in a slow breath, let the silence stretch taut, then leaned closer to the mic. "It's a call sign," I said, each syllable deliberate, unhurried, "and it begins with the letter V." But how did one name unravel a judge and a king of real estate? To understand, we need to rewind 2 weeks earlier. My name is Sarah Sterling, though in my father's house I was rarely called by it. To him, I was simply the quiet one, the daughter who never measured up to the family's shining heir, my brother Mark. My father, Richard Sterling, is a real estate mogul who treats people the way he treats properties, as assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be discarded. And in his ledger, I was always a liability. At family gatherings, I lived in the shadows of mahogany furniture and crystal glasses, where the air smelled of expensive wine and control. Richard's voice would fill the room like a booming auctioneer, selling the illusion of a perfect dynasty. He adored Mark's shallow victories, parading them as proof of his empire's continuity. My own achievements, meticulous, quiet, and far less visible, were brushed aside with a dismissive chuckle or condescending pat on the head. But outside that suffocating house, I lived another life. By day, I was not the timid daughter at the corner of the table. I was a federal analyst, my badge opening doors that locked out ordinary men. Behind sealed walls and humming servers, my voice carried weight among generals and directors. I was Pathfinder, an interpreter of hidden patterns, a reader of dark money trails that funded chaos across continents. This dual existence became my shield. To my family, I was invisible. To my colleagues, I was indispensable. And yet, sitting in that courtroom 2 weeks earlier, I realized my father and his ally, Judge Carmichael, intended to use that invisibility against me. They painted me as fragile, incompetent, unfit to handle my mother's estate. The smell of ink and old paper mixed with my father's cologne as he leaned in, confident, certain he would strip me of what was rightfully mine. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook restraint for ignorance. And in doing so, they made a single fatal error. They gave me reason to fight, not just as a daughter, but as Pathfinder. But where did this fight begin? To answer that, I need to take you back to the quiet cruelties and small humiliations that built the fire I carried into that courtroom. Conflict in my family was never loud. It was quieter than that. Death by 1,000 cuts, each disguised as a joke, a pat on the head, or a toast that never included me. I can still see the Thanksgiving table as if it were set before me now. Polished mahogany, gleaming under chandeliers, silver cutlery aligned with military precision, the air thick with the smell of roasted turkey and my father's cologne. Sharp, expensive, oppressive. My brother, Mark, sat tall at my father's right hand, basking in the glow of approval that never dimmed. That evening, Richard raised his glass, his voice booming. "To Mark," he declared, "for closing that lease deal downtown. A Sterling always delivers." The table erupted in applause. Faces beamed with pride, the clink of crystal echoing like a chorus of loyalty. When the noise subsided, I cleared my throat and spoke softly. "I was awarded the Director's Citation for Excellence this week." My words seemed to hang in the air, fragile, almost embarrassed to exist among the fanfare. For me, it had been monumental recognition, a nod from the highest levels of my field. My father turned, gave me a smile that didn't touch his eyes, and patted my shoulder like I'd drawn a picture for kindergarten. He said, "That's wonderful, honey." His tone dipped in condescension. "Another gold star for your collection." He pivoted back to his conversation about market caps, leaving my achievements crushed under his indifference. Then came the line that branded itself into my memory. Gesturing toward me with his wine glass, he told a cousin, "That's our little G-woman over there." Laughter rippled around the table. The nickname was meant to be endearing, but it was a cage. It reduced my world, my classified briefings, my midnight hours in secure rooms, to a punchline. The sting was sharp, metallic in my throat, but I swallowed it down like I always did. Outwardly quiet, inwardly taking note. Every slight went into an invisible ledger only I could see. The very next day, I stepped into a SIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility. The transition was jarring, from warm wood paneling and candlelight to sterile walls and the hum of servers. The air smelled like filtered electricity. Here, I wasn't little G-woman. Here, I was Pathfinder. My call sign wasn't a joke. It was authority. I presented intelligence to General Evans himself, tracing shell corporations, encrypted channels, and the movement of dirty money that could destabilize entire economies. My words mattered. My silence was respected. When I finished, the general simply nodded. From him, that was worth more than a standing ovation. 2 worlds, 2 versions of me. One dismissed, one indispensable. But when my mother died, those worlds collided. She had been the only person who saw me clearly, the only one who understood the strength behind my quiet. Her estate, what she left me, was her final vote of confidence. And my father could not stand it. Before the hearings began, he leaned close, his breath heavy with mint and wine. "Sarah," he said with false gentleness, "your mother knew you couldn't handle this kind of responsibility. She would want me to protect you from yourself. Protect me." That was his word, but what he wanted was control. He twisted her memory into a tool, a weapon, to strip away the last thing she had entrusted to me. And standing beside him was Judge Carmichael, nodding along like an actor reading his lines. He smirked at my profession, dismissed my testimony as irrelevant, called me naive, irresponsible. In his courtroom, my father's narrative wasn't just a story, it became the official record. That was the moment the old ledger of slights began to burn. Because this wasn't Thanksgiving dinner anymore, this was the law, etched into transcripts and filings. Carmichael's bias wasn't just insulting, it was ammunition. They believed I was powerless. They believed I would stay silent. They were wrong. And as their arrogance grew, so did my resolve. But the pressure didn't explode all at once. It built slowly, unbearably, until it could no longer be contained. The courtroom was never neutral ground. It was my father's theater and Judge Carmichael his co-star. Every hearing felt choreographed. Every word of theirs rehearsed to paint me as the fragile daughter clinging to things beyond her grasp. On the second day of proceedings, Carmichael leaned back in his chair, lips curling. "Miss Sterling," he drawled, "your father built an empire brick by brick. You, on the other hand, seem to file things. Am I getting that right?" His words slithered across the room, drawing laughter from Richard, sharp and cruel, like glass breaking. The court stenographer hesitated, fingers trembling over her keys, but still typed it all down. Every insult preserved, every bias immortalized in the record. I sat still, the smell of varnished wood heavy in the air, listening as my father's lawyers paraded through their narrative. Sarah is irresponsible. Sarah is unstable. Sarah must be protected from herself. Each word was another brick in a wall they believed was closing around me. But I knew walls could also trap the builders inside. During a recess, Richard approached, his cologne cloying in the narrow hallway. His voice dropped to a whisper only I could hear. "Sarah, stop embarrassing yourself. Sign over the estate. Do it quietly, and maybe I'll see to it you're taken care of." His smile was practiced, but his eyes were steel. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat dressed as kindness. I looked him in the eye and felt the familiar mixture of disgust and clarity. I could taste metal in the back of my throat, the same taste I remembered from combat briefings where stakes were measured in lives, not money. The message was clear. If I didn't submit, he would use every resource at his disposal, his lawyers, his allies, even the judge, to break me. But they underestimated one thing. My silence had never been surrender. It had been discipline. And discipline, once sharpened, becomes a blade. The final straw came when Carmichael, in open court, declared, "This witness offers no evidence of financial acumen, nor any real-world value. Her testimony is irrelevant." His voice echoed like a gavel strike itself, each syllable cold, deliberate. My father's laugh followed, rolling through the chamber like thunder. That was it, the last entry in my ledger. Humiliation, officially documented. Bias, signed and sealed into the record. They thought it was my defeat. They didn't realize they had just handed me the opening I needed. Because now, I had grounds to bring my other life into the courtroom, grounds to merge the shadows of my classified world with the glaring light of theirs. That night, back in my apartment, a place more barracks than home, I sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. My hands were steady. The heat of humiliation cooled into something else. Resolve. A cold, surgical resolve. I would not fight them on their terms. Emotion was their battlefield, manipulation their weapon. No, I would fight on mine. Precision, procedure, and the kind of leverage they could neither anticipate nor survive. They believed they had pushed me into a corner. What they didn't know was that I had already begun sketching the map out of it, a map that led directly to their downfall. The question now wasn't if I would strike back, but how. And the first step was to design a plan meticulous enough to collapse their empire from the inside. Plans don't begin with fire. They begin with silence, with listening, with recognizing patterns and waiting for the precise moment to pull a single thread that unravels the entire fabric. That night, I cleared the clutter from my small apartment table until it was bare. The surface smelled faintly of disinfectant, cold under my fingertips. I set down one folder, my mother's will. Next to it, a legal pad. On the top line, I wrote a single word in block letters: leverage. Richard thrived on leverage. Judge Carmichael lived by it. They believed leverage was theirs alone to wield through money, alliances, and manipulation. But they had overlooked one truth: leverage is neutral until someone uses it better. My advantage wasn't louder lawyers or deeper pockets. It was information, classified, precise, devastating. Step 1 was legal, not dramatic. I sat down with my attorney, a quiet woman who understood discretion the way surgeons understand scalpels. Together, we drafted a motion. On the surface, it was dull, bureaucratic, an official request to introduce a sealed federal case file, 71CR 994, Operation Nightfall, as evidence of my professional competence. To the casual eye, it looked desperate. To anyone who understood the file number, it was a flare shot into the night sky. Step 2 was to make sure the flare was seen. Using a secure line, I contacted a liaison within the DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel. My voice was steady, clinical. I didn't ask for favors, I asked a single procedural question. If a judge presiding over a civil matter is named as a person of interest in a sealed federal investigation, what is protocol? The reply was crisp and immediate. The witness is obligated to report the conflict. The motion is correct. The system will escalate. Perfect. Step 3, patience. Once filed, the motion would trigger alarms far beyond this courtroom. DOJ servers would light up. Federal oversight would stir. Carmichael's name, tied to Operation Nightfall, would not vanish into the margins. It would pulse red until someone acted. But I wanted more than procedure. I wanted precision. I reviewed my notes from Nightfall, the shell corporations, the encrypted Cayman accounts, and the asset handler logs. And most importantly, the call sign Vesper. To the uninitiated, it was just code name. To Carmichael, it was a guillotine, because Vesper wasn't a stranger. He was Carmichael's personal financial advisor, the man entrusted with the secrets, the same man who had already flipped and become the primary confidential informant. The beauty of it was brutal. Carmichael's downfall was buried in his own trust. Finally, I prepared myself. I rehearsed, not words, but composure, breathing evenly until the air tasted clean and sharp, imagining the sterile hum of the SEIF instead of the oak-paneled courtroom. My strength would not come from shouting, but from stillness, from letting silence draw their arrogance out like poison before delivering the antidote. This wasn't vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was correction. They wanted to twist the record to erase me. I would make the record itself the weapon. Every smirk, every insult, every biased word, they were bricks in the trap they built themselves. All I needed was to light the fuse. By the time I slid the motion across the courtroom clerk's desk, the plan was complete. On paper, there was nothing but ink. In reality, it was a scalpel pressed to the throat of two men who thought themselves untouchable. The motion was filed. The trap was set. Now came the most dangerous step: execution. And when the day of the final hearing arrived, the air itself felt charged, like a storm crouched just beyond the horizon. The morning of the final hearing, the air felt different, thin, electric, like the charged silence before a storm breaks. As I walked up the courthouse steps, the stone under my heels echoed too loudly, each strike a metronome counting down to detonation. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old paper and furniture polish. a scent I had come to associate with arrogance dressed as authority. My father sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit immaculate, his tie knotted with military precision. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, his pitying smile spread slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the kill. Judge Carmichael was already seated, the motion I had filed resting in his hand as though it were contaminated. He pinched the pages between his fingers, his distaste radiating like heat. "Miss Sterling," he began, voice dripping with sarcasm, "the court has received your unusual request. Before I dismiss this frivolous motion, perhaps you'd care to enlighten us about what a low-level analyst could possibly know about a sealed federal case." He smirked. My father chuckled. Their confidence filled the room like smoke. I remained still. My lawyer shifted uneasily beside me, but I placed a hand on her arm. "Calm. Wait. Let them believe they were scripting my humiliation one last time." The bailiff cleared his throat. The gallery hushed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz softer. I stood and walked toward the witness stand, the microphone gleaming under the overhead lamps. The wood beneath my palm was cool, smooth, grounding me. I adjusted the mic, breathed once, twice. Every eye in the room bore into me, some expectant, some dismissive. Carmichael leaned forward. "Well, Miss Sterling," he pressed, "the court is waiting." I let the silence stretch, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then, evenly, without raising my voice, I said, "I wasn't just an analyst on Operation Nightfall." For the first time, his smirk faltered, the smallest crack in his mask. "I was the handler," I continued, my voice cutting clean through the hush. "The handler for the primary confidential informant whose testimony formed the backbone of the investigation." The words hung in the air like a blade. A chair squeaked in the gallery. My father shifted, confusion flickering across his face. Carmichael tried to recover, his tone sharpening into accusation. "You can't just throw around titles like that. If you're truly a handler, then name the asset." This was the moment I had rehearsed in silence, the moment every insult had led to. I leaned closer to the mic. My voice dropped low, forcing him to lean in to hear. You might know him," I said, each word deliberate, "by his call sign, Vesper." The effect was immediate. The color drained from Carmichael's face, leaving it waxy and gray. His hand trembled against the bench. Behind him, the gavel he had so carelessly wielded earlier sat forgotten. From the back row, two men in dark suits stood, not rushing, not dramatic, simply rising, with quiet inevitability. The gallery whispered, then fell silent again, as if the air itself recognized the shift. I kept my eyes on Carmichael. He wasn't smirking now. He was calculating, panicking, realizing in real time that the name I had spoken was not a bluff. His advisor, his confidant, his betrayer. And in that instant, I knew the plan had worked. The trap had sprung. But the true climax wasn't in the plan itself. It was in the confrontation that followed, when silence turned to collapse and power flipped hands in the space of a single name. The silence after the name Vesper was the kind that pressed against your skin, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't quiet, it was a vacuum. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. Judge Carmichael's jaw slackened. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted, searching the room for an escape route that didn't exist. The courtroom, moments earlier filled with his smirk and my father's laughter, had transformed into a mausoleum of shock. My father turned sharply toward him, confusion etched deep in the lines of his face. "What is she talking about?" he hissed, but his words carried, betraying his panic to everyone present. Carmichael didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he knew. He knew exactly who Vesper was, the man he'd trusted with his most guarded secrets, the financial advisor who managed the labyrinth of shell corporations and hidden accounts, the man who had flipped and fed that information directly into my hands. I was his handler, I repeated slower this time, letting the words roll like thunder across the chamber. Every encrypted message, every offshore transfer, every document you thought was invisible. The stenographer's fingers hovered motionless above the keys. Even she couldn't bring herself to interrupt the moment. Carmichael's hand trembled so violently he knocked over his water glass. The spill spread quickly across the polished bench, seeping into papers, blurring ink. It looked like contamination, like corruption leaking into daylight. From the gallery, a murmur arose, then died as two men in dark suits stepped forward with deliberate calm. They didn't flash badges. They didn't need to. Their very presence carried the weight of federal authority. One leaned down to whisper to the bailiff. The other simply stood, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the judge. Carmichael swallowed hard, his Adam's apple jerking. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, broken. This court must acknowledge an unforeseen conflict of interest. He couldn't even meet my eyes. His gavel lay forgotten beside the spreading pool of water. He stood slowly, his robe hanging loose on suddenly frail shoulders. Then, without ceremony, he walked off the bench, no longer a judge, just a man caught in the web he had spun. All eyes turned to my father. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in him, not the calculated fear of losing money, but raw dread, as though the foundation beneath his empire had collapsed in seconds. My lawyers whispered frantically in his ear, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at the empty judge's chair, realizing the fortress he thought impenetrable had collapsed in seconds. I rose from my seat. My lawyer gave my arm a subtle squeeze, but I felt no triumph, only clarity. My father's face was pale, his confidence drained away. The man who had mocked me, dismissed me, reduced me to a punchline, now sat alone at a table that felt like an island, sinking beneath a tide he could not control. And I had not raised my voice. I had not shouted, nor begged, nor wept. I had spoken a single name, and it had been enough. But the aftermath of victory is never thunderous. It is quiet, and the truest satisfaction would come not in that courtroom, but in the life I built after walking away from it. When the gavel finally struck again, it was in another courtroom, weeks later, this time with a new judge presiding, impartial and unsympathetic to my father's pleas. The estate was secured, my mother's wishes honored, and the legal battle ended not with fireworks, but with paperwork. But for me, the true ending had already happened the moment Carmichael walked off the bench in disgrace. His career was finished, his reputation dissolved. Richard, my father, sat amid his expensive lawyers like a captain abandoned on a sinking ship, the tide of federal scrutiny rising fast around him. His empire, built on arrogance and hidden accounts, had been cracked open by a single word. I didn't need to watch the wreckage. My victory wasn't in seeing him punished. It was in knowing he no longer held power over me. 1 year later, my office window overlooked Washington, D.C., not a suburban street or the echo of family dinners, but the heart of consequence and responsibility. The plaque on my door read simply, Sarah Sterling, Section Chief, Counterterrorism, Finance. No mockery, no diminishment, just recognition earned in silence and steel. My team gathered around me daily. Analysts sharp as blades, hungry for truth. We argued, we laughed, we hunted the patterns of corruption together. They were not my blood, but they were my family, the one I chose and the one that chose me. One afternoon, an email appeared. The sender, Richard Sterling. The subject line, "Please call me." I stared at it for a moment. A year earlier, those words would have twisted my stomach into knots. Now they meant nothing. I right-clicked, archived the message, and returned to the glowing threat matrix on my screen. Pace wasn't something he could give me or take away. It was already mine. Because a true legacy isn't carved into buildings or hidden in bank accounts. It is spoken in the silence that follows a single name. It is written in the respect of those who know your worth. And mine was no longer up for debate.